is for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mike Serra. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Municipalities. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this session on the affordable housing calculation number, the calculation of the affordable housing numbers and reporting requirements. A few housekeeping issues I'd like to address. Let's keep in mind, the passage of A4 signed in the governor last year required the Department of Community Affairs to determine affordable housing numbers, which they did in October and released them. Not without some controversy, obviously. There's litigation. Right now, what we like to focus on in this hour is really give you the opportunity to better understand how the number was formulated, what's behind it, the reporting requirements. Whatever happens, but at least you'll have the tools and information in order to proceed, since you were under a deadline of late January to either accept the DCA number, propose a different number, or go to the courts on your own, of course. Joining us today, and I'd like to thank them for doing this. They were at the league conference, essentially doing this same function, and offered to do this again as well, is Dr. Christopher Wheeler and Keith Henderson, who I will introduce in a moment. Just a couple of more housekeeping items. This is being recorded and it will be made available on the league's website within the next day or so. The presentation will be available as well. And both Keith and Christopher have indicated that they are more than willing to kind of dig in on sort of a one-on-one with any towns that want to learn even more. So you might be able to follow up as well. So hopefully this is a good opportunity to understand what the numbers are, so you can make your planning decisions and choices going forward. I would ask that you please keep yourself muted so during the presentations. If you have questions, you can shoot them to me in the chat box. We'll compile them, and assuming we have time at the end, we'll try to get through as many as possible. With that, let me introduce first Keith Henderson, who is I'll do this in alpha order, is the Director of the Division of Local Planning Services at the Department of Community Affairs, responsible for managing the provisions of planning assistance to eligible municipalities, overseeing the review of municipal area needs of redevelopment determinations, administration of the Main Street program, supervising GIS projects, and of course, implementing the municipal reporting and education programs delegated to the Department of Community Affairs under the law signed earlier this year. Keith has been with the department for a number of years, is recognized as an expert, holding a degree on city and regional planning from Rutgers University, has been a licensed planner for over 35 years, and as I mentioned, 27 years with the Department of Community Affairs. Dr. Wheeler, Christopher Wheeler, PhD, is the Chief Data Officer for the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs. He is responsible for managing the department's data analysis and reporting functions and performed the DCA calculations for the fourth round present need obligations and two components of the prospective need obligations. Dr. Wheeler holds a PhD in public affairs from Rutgers Camden, a master's degree in government administration from UPenn, and a BA in political science from Temple. So again, I thank them both. They are very generous with their time and willing to talk to communities and work through this process. So thank you both for being at the conference, for doing this, and I'm sure the partnership that will go on as well. So I'm gonna kick it to you. I don't know who's first. So
I guess I can jump in. I just want to thank you, Mike, and thank the league for inviting us to present on our calculations. We did prepare a PowerPoint for you to see, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can bring that up. Okay, can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we just want to talk a little bit about our work in developing the affordable housing calculations and also some of the reporting requirements in the affordable housing management system. All of this is pursuant to Public Law 2024, Chapter 2, that established the formula and methodology for the fourth round obligations. So the affordable housing law establishes two sets of obligations for municipalities. The first is present need, and these are the deficient housing units that are occupied by low and moderate income households in a housing region. And these are typically addressed by housing rehabilitation programs. Now, a really important thing about middle present need is they are not actual units that are identified as being deficient. They are census estimates. There's a formula set forth in the law that requires us to use certain data sets to calculate estimates of the number of units. So they're not actual literal properties. So we do this formula. We calculate numbers for every municipality. And according to the formula, about 70% of the present need numbers are estimates of overcrowded low and moderate income occupied housing that is over 50 years old. And another 30% is low and moderate income occupied housing that lacks complete plumbing or kitchen facilities. Now, the second component is a little bit more prominent, is prospective need, and that is the housing that's needed to meet the needs of additional low and moderate income households over the next 10 years from 2025 to 2035. And this is often addressed by new housing production. Unlike present need, 47 urban municipalities are exempt from prospective need, and they're excluded from the calculation. These are qualified urban aid communities. Now, there are 62 urban aid communities, but you have to meet additional criteria to be a qualified urban aid municipality and not have prospective need. These include criteria relating to vacant property, substandard housing concentrations, and other factors. So 47 qualified urban aid, 62 urban aid municipalities. There are several urban aid municipalities that are not qualified and are not exempt from prospective need. Just a quick overview of the housing regions. So in the law, the housing regions are the exact same regions that have traditionally been included in COA's housing region definitions. So regions 1 and 2 are the North Jersey regions. Regions 3 and 4 roughly align with Central Jersey, and regions 5 and 6 are the South Jersey regions. So this is how the prospective need calculation works in a nutshell. There are three equally weighted components to the prospective need calculation. The first is the income capacity factor, and that is a measure of how wealthy a municipality is relative to the lowest income municipality in the housing region. So for region 1, that would be Patterson. For region 2, that would be Newark, to give you an idea. So basically, the wealthier you are, the higher of an obligation you would have from this income capacity factor. And there are two components of that. One that takes into account the size of your municipality through the number of households, and one that just basically looks at income levels in isolation. The second factor is the equalized non-residential valuation factor. This is the 24-year growth in your commercial and industrial ratables as a share of the region. So if your community has grown significantly in terms of your commercial base, a lot of new retail, a lot of new development, warehouses, things like that, more than the rest of your region, you would have a higher obligation through that factor. And the last factor is the land capacity factor that my colleague Keith Henderson will explain in more detail. So to get your prospective need, we average all three of these factors and we multiply it by the regional prospective need. And that gives us each municipality's obligation. The law also allows communities to cap their obligations at the lesser of 1,000 units or 20% of their households. So we perform that calculation in our non-binding calculation spreadsheet. And that is publicly available on our DCA website. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Keith Henderson, who's the Director of Local Planning Services, who can speak about the land capacity analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Wheeler. So as we've indicated previously in some of the conversations we've had in our presentation down at the League, we did a vacant land capacity analysis statewide following the criteria that are laid out in the Public Law 2024, Chapter 2. And that legislation gave us very specific directions to follow in terms of how to do that analysis. So first of all, it's important to note that the entire area that's included as part of the vacant land analysis is limited only to the state planning, the state plan planning areas 1, 2, and 3, centers, And then there were other specific carve-outs for conforming highlands municipalities, as well as regional growth areas and Pinelands towns. So the way that basically worked is that when we did our analysis, we looked at the entire state and we cropped out everything that was not part of those criteria and didn't look at those at all. So we didn't look at any planning area 4 or planning area 5 or highlands restricted areas or anything along those lines, with one exception that I'll get to in a minute. We started with the land cover data that's produced by the Department of Environmental Protection. And there are codes that are based on that data set that look at whether an area is forested or vacant or urban and built up. And based on the codes that are included in that, we use that as the starting point to identify what was potentially vacant land. We originally looked at the possibility of using the Mod 4 data sets, which you all know is the tax assessor's data set. But there are a lot of anomalies within that data set, not the least of which is that there are probably 600,000 or 700,000 out of 3.4 million parcels in the state that don't have any data in them at all. The reason for that is because the tax assessor's job is not to provide a data set that's going to be used by engineers or planners. Their job is to produce tax bills, right? So if they have multiple properties that are next to each other and they're all in the same ownership and they're all in the same use, they're not going to generate different tax bills for each one of those parcels. They're going to generate one. And as a result, in the Mod 4 data set, they don't put any information for those adjoining properties that are part of the one sort of aggregated tax bill. So that's a little bit of a difficulty. And after looking at that and looking at the property class codes that are there, we decided not to use Mod 4 data to actually identify vacant land, but rather we used it to remove areas that could not possibly be vacant developable land. So it may appear, just as an example, it may appear in the land cover data as a wooded area that might be coded as being vacant land. But we know that from looking at the Mod 4 data that underneath those trees, it's the backyards of single-family detached homes. So based on that type of analysis, we were able to remove all of those properties as well as rights of way. Anything that was not actually coded as a parcel was removed. And an area where that would have an impact would be, again, using tree cover. If the trees cover the road and the aerial imagery can't see the road, it might be coded as potentially vacant land. So we removed all of that. We then also removed all of the constrained lands based on data that's available from DEP, as well as a couple of other places. Anything that was preserved farmland, open space, recreation areas, conservation foundation areas, wetlands, steep slopes, wetlands buffers, waterways, waterway buffers, everything that would potentially constrain development, those were also all removed. The age of that data set is about 4 or 5 years. So we also looked at building permits that were issued over the course of the last 5 years and removed any properties that were coded as being vacant, but we know that building permits have been issued. So that was how we got to the end result. And one final step that we looked at was we then looked at the Mod 4 data to see whether there were any chances that tax assessors included any side notes off on some of the note columns that are included in there to try to identify things that might be utility rights of way or detention basins or homeowner association properties, anything along those lines that would give us an indication that although it might be coded as vacant land, that it's not developable based on that. So the one exception that I want to point out with regard to the planning areas, and this is directly from the legislation, is that in previous rounds, and I think Dr. Wheeler is going to touch on this in a second, but in previous rounds, the weighting of areas was based on planning areas 1 and 2 had a 1-to-1 weighting factor. Planning area 3, the fringe area, had a 0.5 weighting factor, and planning areas 4 and 5 had a 0. In the current legislation, the non-conforming Highlands municipalities, whether they were in planning areas 4 or 5, were legislatively decided to have a 1-to-1 weighting factor if they were in a sewer service area. So some of those Highlands municipalities will see a little bit of a change in the vacant land as it related to what was calculated in the third round. So that's basically that for now, and we have published the resulting composite data layer on our website, which is available, and I think we might have some links towards the end of this webinar. If it's not in the slide deck, we can post some things in the chat.
Thank you, Keith. So just want to highlight some changes to the way that the obligations are calculated versus the third round. The fourth round did implement some major changes, particularly to how regional prospective need is calculated. In the third round and in the previous rounds, it was based on a population projection that was typically produced by the Department of Labor. This population projection was converted to the number of low and moderate income households using census microdata. And I think the fair share analysis in the third round put that at about 138,471 units. For the fourth round, there was a revision to basis on household growth that had happened historically over the last 10 years. So regional prospective need is 40% of 2010 to 2020 household growth, and that is about 85,000 units. That's a 39% decrease from the previous methodology. So a significant reduction in the top line number in the legislation. There were also some major changes to the secondary sources of supply and demand. They were eliminated in the fourth round. These were conversions and demolitions of low and moderate income occupied housing that had previously been in the calculation, and this was removed. In the third round, this component had added an additional 31,355 units to that 138, and that is not present in our calculation by the law. And then there were also some changes to the weights in the land capacity analysis, as Keith talked about. For the fourth round, Highlands planning areas that have a state designated sewer service area, and critical word here is state designated sewer service area. That is a Highlands municipality that is not a Highlands conforming municipality. These are weighted at 1 in the fourth round compared to 0 in the third round. So these types of areas, did receive more obligations as a result of these areas being included in vacant developable land. And this is a decision the legislature made to the formula. Some other really important differences. We did update the qualified urban aid municipality list with the latest available data. With that, 5 communities lost their qualified urban aid municipality status. And these are Monroe Township in Gloucester County, the Township of Brick, Borough of Pensgrove, the Town of Phillipsburg, and Neptune Township. However, 6 communities gained this status and have no prospective need in the fourth round, according to our calculation. And that is Bergenfield, Cliffside Park, Township of Nutley, Harrison Town in Hudson County, Town of Kearney, and the Borough of Glassboro. There were also some changes to commercial industrial ratables since the last time this was calculated. From 2015 to 2023, there was a boom in warehouse production throughout the state. So many communities have seen bigger obligation increases per our calculation as a result of this. A good example of that would be Logan Township in Gloucester County. Again, there were some pretty significant changes in household income since the last time this was calculated for the third round. We had a number of communities that had very substantial income gains, in excess of their regions. A good example of this is Flemington Borough in Huntington County. So communities that have seen these income gains will have higher obligations as a result by the dictates of the formula. And finally, reductions in vacant developable land. Communities that lost less vacant land or at a slower rate than their regions will have higher obligations because there's more of the developable land within their region, within their borders, as a result of not having a lot of development between the 2 rounds. So these are what our present need numbers look like. Again, this is the rehabilitation component of it. We calculated 65,410 units statewide, pretty similar to previous calculations of this for the third round. The way that is calculated did not differ significantly from the previous rounds. So the final number is actually not that different. The majority of these units are in regions 1 and 2 in North Jersey. And region 1 has the highest total at 23,741. And the South Jersey counties have about a little over 9,000 units, and by far the lowest present need obligations in that region of the state. And these are what the prospective need obligations look like. We calculated 85,000 roughly as the statewide number. And when you apply that at 1,000 unit, 20% cap for each individual municipalities, that comes down to about 81,000 units. Again, region 1 and region 2 have a majority of the units, around 48,000. And the South Jersey counties by far have the lowest obligations. And that is because they've experienced very slow household growth from 2010 to 2020. So a lot of those municipalities in that region of the state have lower obligations just from that. This is a map of what the prospective need obligations look like by our calculation, with the 1,000 unit 20% cap implemented. As you can see, there were very high concentrations in some of the more suburban areas of the state within North and Central Jersey. Again, the regional needs are greater there because there's been greater historical household growth in those regions of the state. We don't see as much in South Jersey for those reasons, but there is, some larger obligations in the South Jersey suburbs outside of Philadelphia. And with that, we just have a little bit on the affordable housing monitoring system, and I turn it back over to my colleague Keith Henderson.
Thank you again, Dr. Wheeler. So for those of you who have been involved with this since the days of COA, there used to be a system that was called the COA Tracking and Monitoring, or CTM system, that was used to collect municipal collections and expenditures of affordable housing trust funds, as well as the completion of units that were included in municipal fair share plans. The new law requires that municipalities provide that reporting, as it has been done in the past. And many of you may know that we've rolled out a new system to replace the old CTM system with a new system that's called the Affordable Housing Monitoring System, or AHMS. We did 4 webinars, I believe, back in September, in anticipation of what was the first reporting requirement in the law, which was September 16th, I think. And what will happen now is that there's new reporting that's required annually on February 15th of each year. We've made some refinements to the system that we rolled out in September, and it should be even easier to use, a little bit more user-friendly. And we will be conducting some webinars on Thursday and Friday of this week. We sent out via GovConnect egg notices to all municipalities, indicating the registration information for those 2 webinars. We don't have them up on our website yet, but it's one of my next things to get done, hopefully today or by tomorrow at the latest. But if you didn't receive that information, talk to your municipal clerk about the egg notice that was sent out, and the information on how to register for those webinars is available in there.
All right, thank you. So we just wanted to highlight some helpful tools and information as you're thinking about your planning and how you want to look at doing your housing element fair share plan. We do have some public-facing resources that are available to help you. Our community asset map is publicly available on our website, and it offers a robust and interactive mapping tool that allows you to identify and highlight community assets. These could include things like schools, colleges, hospitals, parks. But we also have parcel-specific information, so you can look at that, have information on the property class, and other, summary information from Mod 4. You can overlay your areas in need of redevelopment and revitalization on the map. We have walkability scores, census data on population growth, job concentrations, a lot of state development incentive areas, such as the urban enterprise zones and the federal opportunity zones. All of that can be layered on here. And this can really be a great resource when you're thinking about areas where you want to target for your affordable housing development, to see what is in place within your community and what incentives are already overlaid in these target areas. So you can find more information about our community asset map through that link here, and I think the slides will be provided so you get that link. So you see the link there for the community asset map. And we also have a link to our calculations and methodology at the link at the very bottom, so you can actually delve into the nitty-gritty and see how we actually came up with your numbers from that calculation spreadsheet, and also a detailed explanation of how we got to the numbers through a Word-based methodology document. And finally, we just wanted to create an opportunity for individual calculation briefings. We're providing the ability for you to sign up for 30-minute virtual meetings with DCA professionals. We will offer an explanation of your individual affordable housing calculations. We set up a reservation request site that you can log on to and put in your preferred time. We do ask that you have no more than 3 attendees attend, so we can keep it within that 30 minutes. But we do want to give you an opportunity to meet personally with us so we can explain how we got to your particular community's number, and we're very happy to do that for you. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you both. And we'll also the league will push out the information about those 30-minute virtual meetings as well, which I referenced at the beginning. There are some questions in the box, and I will get to them in a minute. Let me, if you don't mind, if I can take the prerogative, because I've received some questions, and there's a few of them have been very similar in nature, and I guess it's the result that there was land data that just basically became available that wasn't available as you were going through this process, and was I guess was just recently released, which I think kind of started this. I've heard from a couple of towns, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment or a response, who indicate that they believe that land that was identified as vacant is part of the third round plan, which is either on about to come online, or will be coming online down the road. Is how much of a factor is that, and how can they identify that with you? Keith,
I think
you're
you're
muted.
muted, Keith.
Sorry, I turned off the wrong button. It was a little bit of a difficult process, and we had to work with within the confines of what the legislature dictated to us. And, unfortunately, we don't really have a way of looking to see what projects were included in previously approved third round plans. Once the court took that process over, there was no standardized way of the courts reporting back to the rest of the world, let alone DCA, what particular properties were included in things. I know that there were hundreds of settlement agreements, but we don't really have a way of looking through all of those to identify specific tracts of land or parcels that were included in the delivery mechanisms for third round plans. So the short answer to it is that none of those properties are excluded from the vacant land analysis that we did. And it's not just approved affordable housing sites. Anything that was approved but not yet built, we would have no way of knowing what planning boards are doing at the local level to be able to have a standardized listing of that. And I use the word standardized a couple of times because it's important to note that it's an exercise that we're doing at the statewide level, looking at all of this information from a bird's eye view, literally. And we don't have the boots on the ground working experience and knowledge that every municipality has. Now, you can look out your window and know what's in your backyard, but we're in Trenton and we're basically looking at data and trying to use data to come up with describing characteristics that you can describe much more easily with your eyes just by looking out your window. We just don't have the luxury of that. So we don't have any of that information, so we were not able to include it. We did, as I said before, we looked at building permits that were issued. So if there were sites that were potentially vacant when the aerial imagery was done back in 2020, and building permits had since been issued, and we do have a list of building permits by block and lot, we were able to exclude many of those, but again, not all of those, because what happens, as I'm sure you know, is that what used to be block 1, lot 1, and that's what it shows in our records as, once it gets subdivided and building permits are issued, it might be block 1.01, lots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And if we don't have a record of that to be able to include it in the analysis that's done, then it would have gotten not included in the analysis that we've done.
I would imagine, I know you don't have, you can't change the projections, obviously. You issued them on a certain date, but that might be something that someone might be able to get an insight into by taking advantage of these 30-minute meetings with you as they go forward, exactly what the impact might be on them if that was their circumstance. So I've kind of suggested to those towns that they speak to you directly to kind of give some thought to how they need to respond to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's see. All right, let me just run through what's here in the box. A lot of similar themes. How will our calculations impacted if there's no available land to accomplish the goal?
Well, I think the way that the legislature laid out the formula, the land capacity is just one of 3 factors. So even if you had a land capacity factor of 0, you could still have an obligation from the income and non-residential rateable growth components. And I think in those cases, it might make more sense thinking about adaptive reuse, ADUs, other, types of solutions where you wouldn't have to rely on, vacant developable land, redevelopment opportunities, things like that, and also take advantage of the bonus credits that are available from the legislation as well for specific types of housing.
And I think in addition to that, one of the things that's really important to note about the land capacity analysis as part of the methodology is that set of numbers is designed, as the legislation indicates, to provide municipalities with guidance as to what to look for in developing plans. And so it's important to note that the areas that we identified, could be, more or less than what actually exists. But the most important thing is that the purpose of the analysis was to identify potentially unconstrained developable land just for the purposes of feeding that methodology. It does not identify particular sites that are supposed to be considered for the development of affordable housing. In fact, I'll tell you that the resulting outputs that we have are not based on parcels. They're based on just whatever shape exists where there's potentially vacant land. So the distinction has to be made between the methodology and what was provided in order to comply with the legislation and the implementation side of things as municipalities develop plans. So historically, there has always been a vacant land adjustment process that was previously put in place by COA and carried forward in the 3rd round by the courts, and will presumably be carried forward in the 4th round by the Affordable Housing Dispute Resolution Program. So, literally, if there's no possibility for developing anything because you literally have 0 vacant land, that would be part of what you're presenting to the Affordable Housing Dispute Resolution Program as one of the things to consider as part of the development of your fair share plan. Now, again, historically, we don't know what the program is going to do in the future, but historically, what would result from that process would be a calculation of what was called realistic development potential. And that would be based on whatever vacant, unconstrained developable land was potentially available, at the actual identified boots on the ground analysis, and then taking a look at surrounding densities to see what would be an appropriate density, doing some math and coming up with a number of units that could be addressed. And there was typically a calculation that was called unmet need, which would be the difference between what the initial obligation is and what the realistic development potential is. And the municipality would then be required to come up with some sort of mechanism that would capture unforeseen opportunities, such as redevelopment or adaptive reuse, or just things that weren't envisioned at the time of the development of the fair share plan. So again, we don't know the extent to which the program is going to carry that process forward, or how they're going to carry it forward if they do. But it's all part of the development of the actual implementation side of things.
All right, got this question in a couple of different forms. Specifically, this one was, are county-owned parks and our municipality factored into our land capacity? And I think with that, you could also include state-owned property or parks and so forth. But how does that factor into the land capacity?
Anything that was identified on the publicly available data set produced by DEP, which includes municipal parks and recreation facilities, county, state, anything that was park, anything that's on a Rossi, anything that was owned by a conservation foundation, anything that was prohibited from development as a result of any of those kinds of deed restrictions or regulations, anything that was preserved farmland, all of those areas were excluded from the vacant land analysis.
Well, the next question I got here was that for smaller municipalities with populations under 1,000 and no building land, how will calculations be impacted? I think you kind of addressed that already, but Keith before, but
You know, it'll
yeah.
depend on what your number is. You know, if you're that small and have very little vacant land, I would imagine that your obligation would probably be relatively small. But again, it's just a difference between what the guidance number is that was produced by DCA. What every municipality has the opportunity when they go before the program to be able to indicate what they believe their responsibility should be, based on following the methodology that's in the legislation. But implementation and the targeted numbers are sort of two different things.
All right. Let's see. Another question about based on land ineligible for development, how do you recalculate the prospective need number? I guess the first thing I would suggest to them is to schedule a meeting with you guys, to kind of dig into that, but then that would come up with the action that they need to take at the end of January to recalculate based on what they have found. All right.
Correct.
Does anything you want to add to that? But getting some thank yous through here through the chat, so you should take some pride in that. That's nice. Let's see. This is a very technical question. Vacant land that lacks street access or frontage, should this be included as vacant land? What minimum size or dimension is used, and what is the basis for this area and dimensions?
Well, the analysis that was done, I can't emphasize enough, is really based on data analysis. And so there's not really a good way, using the tools that are available in GIS and some of the other data sets that we were able to use as inputs, to get into that really narrow level of detail. It's possible that areas that we counted as vacant land don't have frontage on a street. They could be part of a parcel where the parcel may have frontage on the street, but only a portion of the parcel was counted, because not the entire parcel is developable. Some of the property, if you look at a tax parcel level, some of it may be environmentally constrained and some of it may not be. And if the unconstrained area was towards the rear of the property and not on a frontage, it was still included. But again, I have to emphasize that the purpose of the exercise was not to identify specific tax lots on which property or on which affordable housing or anything for that matter could be built. It was just a matter of identifying sort of amorphous shaped areas that are vacant and unconstrained developable land. And one of the things I'd like for everybody to sort of consider when they're looking at this is that you have available to now a level of transparency that you've never seen before. You know, I don't know if anyone in this meeting right now had an opportunity to go back to the courts in the third round and say, hey, Judge Jacobson, let me take a look at how you calculated our vacant land area. Let me see the map that shows what it is and where it is. So you haven't had the opportunity to do that before, and I would venture to guess that if there was some mechanism in place that allowed that to happen, you'd probably see very similar results to what we've produced. Because again, I can't emphasize enough, there's not a way for us to sit in Trenton and look at data based on aerial imagery and data sets that are collected from a variety of state agencies and be able to make a determination as to the precise suitability of a particular parcel, right? You have the ability to do that at the local level because you know your town. We just don't have the luxury of being able to do that. So it becomes, sort of an exercise in terms of if everybody's sort of treated uniformly, whether the development capacity based on vacant land is something that can be actually realized or not, as long as everybody's sort of put into the same way of looking at things. You got to keep in mind that the metric is based on the municipality's percentage of the region, right? So if everybody in the region is facing the same anomalies, then it's a percentage of all those same anomalies. I think part two of the question had to do with what was excluded in terms of a minimum. There were two minimums that we looked at. One was with regard to steep slopes, and based on some regulations that are in place in the Highlands, and I consider them to probably be the only entity in the state that I would call the experts on steep slopes. They have a steep slope conservation area that's based on a minimum of 5,000 square feet. So we excluded anything that was more than 5,000 square feet of steep slopes. Anything less than that was included. And also in terms of a minimum size of an area that was counted as vacant, we used 2,500 square feet, based on really pretty much just based on the fact that, especially in a lot of the more urbanized areas, there's a 25 by 100 square foot lot would be something that you could probably build on. There are a lot of areas that, if you look at the mapping that we pasted in the chat before, you can zoom into particular areas and you'll see things that you'll say, well, you can't do anything with that. And you're probably right. But there are areas where it might be a very thin, narrow strip of something that results in anomaly resulting from inconsistencies between data sets from different sources that could be, just to make up an example, it could be 7 feet wide by 1,000 feet long, and it's 7,000 square feet, so it's not excluded. But could you actually do anything with it? No. But is there a way of building any kind of algorithm or any kind of AI tool that would scour 3.4 million data sets in the state and try to come up with a way of making those exclusions? No.
I'm going to combine about 3 or 4, maybe 5 questions, kind of into one because it's along the same theme. And I think you've answered this in a different context, but I think maybe have a discussion in terms of this. Some folks are asking about the impact on particularly the land capacity of environmental factors, and but both already predetermined the proposed NJDEP real rules and the state plan, which of course all came after the deadline for you to project these numbers. So can you talk to sort of what can it, can be the interrelationship between those factors?
Our statutorily, our work is done, and it was done at the time frame that we were required to do it. So, to go after the fact, and it's just not a possibility to do that. We don't know where the state plan is going to go yet. There's going to be a cross acceptance process and a new system for pursuing plan endorsement. Same thing with the DEP regulations. The regulations that were in play at the time were considered to the extent that environmentally sensitive areas were mapped and publicly available, but rules that are still proposed or mapping criteria that hasn't developed by DEP and made public, there's not a way we could do it. One of the things that's important to recognize also is that again, it goes back to that transparency issue. We did our best to make sure that we used only publicly available data, with the idea being that, and if you look at the methodology that we published on our website, it gives a very detailed explanation as to what was done and how it was done and what the input data sets were. We wanted to have something that was potentially replicable by anybody, so that you could follow word by word what we said we did, how we did it, and come up with at least reasonably close to the same answer. And one of the hindrances, of course, with that was that with Daniel's law and the redaction of property owners in the tax lists, we were not able to use property ownership as a way of identifying something that should technically be excluded. So I'm sure that when you look more closely at things, you'll find some of those types of things, but we just didn't have access to those data. And again, we wanted it to be something that anybody could look at and potentially replicate on their own. And so the limitations were what the limitations were.
I'll say, so you don't have to. The numbers that came out in October aren't binding, and there's an opportunity through as you at the local level to take into account maybe factors that you didn't have access to, and it might have been helpful if some of this was done. You didn't choose the order of how this was done, but there was some data that might have been helpful to have in advance, but that this wasn't how it was done. But you do have till the end of the January 31st deadline to accept or propose to amend the projections that may or may not be able, you may take account of some of these factors. I'll lead into another one, was flooding. Was sort of an offshoot of that. If neighborhoods that were flood frequently, easier to say, flood frequently, were considered in the calculations.
They were not. Although I would say that, especially when it comes to the shoreline areas, because most of those shoreline areas, they're in barrier islands, they would have gotten a vacant land weighting factor of 0. But it's important to note also that the vacant land analysis is only one component of the methodology that was used. So we've published, thanks to some of the information put together by Dr. Wheeler, he's put together an Excel spreadsheet that lists all of the different criteria that are used to come up with every municipality's individual number. And you can see that there's a third of the weighting is based on community wealth, and a third of it is based on non-residential ratables, which is sort of a surrogate for job creation, and a third of it is based on the vacant land part. So you might look at a barrier island area, for example, and see that they had a weighted vacant land capacity of 0. There are a lot of municipalities in the state that had weighted vacant land capacity of 0, right? But they still have an obligation based on the income capacity and the change in non-residential ratables. So, it's all a matter of just complying with the law and following what the law says to produce the methodology. And I can't emphasize enough, there's a difference between the non-binding guidance numbers that are produced by DCA as part of following what it says in the legislation, and the implementation of what each municipality is going to present to the Affordable Housing Dispute Resolution Program as a viable fair share plan. So, and that part of it is not anything that DCA is going to be involved in.
All right, Keith, can you, all the links that you just mentioned are in the PowerPoint, which will be made available, as well. Could you drop into the box and I'll share with everyone the link to request an interview? A meeting.
I have to defer to Dr. Wheeler on that. He's set something up with, I forget what it's called, Microsoft Bookings or something.
Microsoft Bookings. Yeah, I'll send it to you in the chat, Mike.
Okay. I believe I've addressed the questions. I grouped a bunch of them together. So, with that, unless there are any other questions, I think we could wrap it up. While we're waiting, I could do a plug. I would recommend that communities take advantage of that. That is unprecedented. That's a great opportunity to follow up with these two gentlemen, and I'll drop that in the chat in a moment as well. This recording will be made available on the league website along with the presentation within about a day or so. I just dropped that link in, and I'll do another song and dance for a couple of seconds so people can copy it, and we'll leave it live. But with that, unless there are any other questions, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Both in Atlantic City at the league conference today, and going forward, and hopefully communities will find it of benefit, and we'll certainly circle back to you as needed. But thank you both. Have a great day.
Thank you, Mike.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.